The Ardennes forest was silent, the kind of silence that freezes sound before it can travel. Snow lay thick over the pine branches, each one sagging under the weight of winter, and the air stung like broken glass. It was December 16th, 1944, the morning the last German offensive in the West began. Before dawn, the stillness shattered. The woods erupted with artillery fire that rolled like thunder through the valleys of Belgium and Luxembourg. Trees splintered, men scrambled for cover, and miles away in the fog-shrouded town of Bastogne, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division awoke to the sound of war returning. To the Americans, the Ardennes had seemed a place for rest. After months of combat across France and Holland, the forests near Bastogne were considered a quiet sector, the ghost front. There were no major attacks expected here, just snow, frostbite, and routine patrols. Men dug shallow foxholes in frozen ground, built makeshift fires under ponchos, and tried to dry socks that never quite thawed. Then the earth itself began to shake. German panzers, Panther and Tiger tanks rolled out of the mist, followed by waves of infantry. It was Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's final gamble, to split the Allied line, capture Antwerp, and force a peace on his terms. The spearhead of that attack aimed straight at Bastogne. Within days, the American positions were swallowed by snow and chaos. Units were scattered, radio contact lost, ammunition dwindling. The 101st Airborne, under the command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, was rushed to Bastogne to hold the crossroads at all costs. Reinforcements from the 10th Armored Division joined them, their Shermans already battered and low on fuel. By December 19th, the town was surrounded. The Germans closed in from all sides, cutting roads, ambushing convoys, isolating the defenders in a ring of ice and steel. Supplies couldn't get through, and the weather grounded Allied aircraft. For 7 days, Bastogne became an island of defiance in a white ocean of enemy troops. Everything froze: boots, rations, even rifles. The lubricants inside the M1 Garand and carbines solidified into waxy glue. Mortars jammed, grenades misfired. Soldiers breathed into their rifle bolts to keep them warm enough to cycle, their fingers bleeding through torn gloves. The cold was not a background detail, it was the enemy. You didn't fight the Germans, you fought the cold, and you hoped the Germans froze faster. And yet amid all this misery, one weapon refused to quit. The Browning M1919A4, the medium machine gun that had already fought across North Africa, Italy, and Normandy, kept firing when everything else failed. It was heavy, awkward, and brutally loud, but it was unstoppable. While rifles froze shut, the Brownings sang. That was the word men used, singing, because in the endless silence between artillery barrages, the rhythmic clatter of a Browning was more than mechanical noise. It was music. It was proof that they were still holding. The M1919A4 was the beating heart of the defense, a machine born from John Browning's genius and perfected for the kind of hell Bastogne had become. Air-cooled and gas-operated, it could fire 400 to 600 rounds per minute of .306 ammunition, heavy enough to punch through snowbanks, walls, and even thin tank armor. Each gun was manned by a crew of 3, the gunner, the assistant, and the ammo bearer. They shared one another's breath and frost, operating the gun with a ritual precision that bordered on sacred. In the trenches around Bastogne, their lives depended on that rhythm. Feed the belt, tap the lid, fire 3-second bursts, clear the casing, and repeat. There were no luxuries here. The snow melted only when it hit the gun barrel, hissing to steam. Crews slept beside their Brownings because the metal would seize if left unattended. The oil froze every few hours, so they used anything with heat to keep the mechanism alive. Breath, fire, even urine. When the enemy came, they fought not just to kill, but to keep the gun warm enough to live. One gunner from the 501st Paratroop Infantry Regiment later wrote, "You didn't think about the enemy. You thought about the gun. As long as it kept firing, we had a chance." The Germans came again and again. The first assaults probed the American lines, small teams of infantry supported by mortars. But the Browning crews, hidden in snowbanks and behind stone walls, tore them apart. The sound of the M1919 was distinctive, a slow, mechanical growl that rolled through the fog. German veterans, used to the shrill whine of their MG-42s, were unsettled by its steadiness. It sounded like it was thinking, like it never hurried, never missed, one prisoner later recalled. As the siege deepened, the Brownings became the backbone of every defensive sector. At Foy, at Marvy, at Noville, men fought until the barrels glowed red through frost. Some guns were fired so long that the paint peeled off their receivers. When ammunition belts froze together, soldiers pried them apart with knives or teeth. One frozen gun crew near Hemrule was found with their gloves burned off, hands blackened from clutching the overheated weapon. They never abandoned it. Inside Bastogne, as mortars thumped and shells whistled overhead, the Brownings provided the only constant. The medics heard them in the background while tending to the wounded. Officers used their bursts to judge whether the perimeter still held. Each company knew the sound of its own guns, and when one fell silent, they knew someone had died. A sergeant of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment recalled, "You didn't need a map. You could tell who was still alive by which Browning was still talking." By the third night, food was scarce. The wounded lay in snow-filled foxholes, and the sky glowed faintly red from distant fires. Yet through the wind, through the screaming and the shells, the Brownings kept their rhythm. They were not glamorous weapons, not the sleek M1 Garand or the powerful bazooka, but they were steady, loyal, and relentless, like the men who fired them. As the siege tightened and the days grew shorter, those machine guns came to symbolize something greater than firepower. They were the pulse of resistance itself, the iron lungs of a town that refused to die. When everything else froze solid in the Ardennes, the Brownings kept breathing. And with every burst that rattled through the snow, they whispered the same defiant truth: Bastogne still stands. Before Bastogne became a name etched in steel and memory, it was just another Belgian market town, a quiet crossroads where 7 roads met in the shadow of the Ardennes. By December 1944, those 7 roads had become lifelines, and the soldiers defending them knew that if Bastogne fell, the heart of the Allied front would bleed out. In that frozen labyrinth of forest and farmland, the Browning M1919A4 was more than a weapon. It was the spine that held the defense upright. To understand why, one must understand the gun itself and the men who served it. The M1919A4 was a descendant of John Browning's first great machine gun, the water-cooled M1917, a weapon that had ended World War I with clouds of steam rising from its jacket. But Browning, an inventor who built machines for endurance rather than spectacle, knew that wars would not always be fought from trenches. He envisioned a lighter, air-cooled design, one that could be carried forward by the infantry, set up on a tripod or even a wall, and fire without the cumbersome water tanks and hoses. The M1919A4 was his answer. Gas-operated, belt-fed, brutally efficient. It fired the same .30-06 cartridge as the American riflemen, but with the persistence of thunder. Each weapon weighed about 31 pounds without the tripod, 47 pounds when mounted. It was fed by 250-round canvas belts, each round the size of a man's finger, each casing polished by the cold. Its maximum effective range stretched beyond 1,000 yards. But in the snowbound forests of Bastogne, the fights happened at 50. Its cyclic rate, 450 to 600 rounds per minute, was slow by German standards, but deliberate by design. It meant stability, precision, and fewer jams in the mud and frost. In an age where the MG42 could shred air with its 1,200 rounds per minute, the Browning's deep, rhythmic cadence was almost hypnotic. Slower, steadier, the sound of confidence rather than panic. But a Browning was never alone. It was always part of a team, and that team was a small world within the chaos of battle. The gunner, who carried the weapon and knew every sound it made, was the heart of it. His hands were often cracked and bleeding from cold. His palms burned raw from the metal. The assistant gunner sat close, feeding the belt, clearing jams, spotting targets. He carried spare barrels and belts draped over his shoulders like ammunition scarves. And the ammo bearer, the youngest of the three, ran through snow and shell fire to bring more boxes from the rear, slipping on ice, shouting over the roar, always coming back with the weight of life itself slung across his back. They spoke little while firing. Communication came in gestures, a tap on the helmet to reload, a hand signal to shift fire, a brief nod when the enemy line wavered. The sound of the gun became their language. A stuttering burst meant the feed was catching. A smooth, heavy rhythm meant everything was working. Each crew had its rituals. They named their guns: Old Betsy, Rosie, the Beast. They talked to them, cursed them, thanked them. In the still moments before dawn, they wiped frost from the receiver with gloved hands and murmured like priests tending to an altar. The Ardennes winter tested every bolt and bone. Temperatures dropped to -25 degrees Celsius, freezing oil solid inside weapon housings. Rifles became paperweights. Even the sturdy Garand gas systems choked in the cold. But the M1919A4, air-cooled, with wide tolerances and a heavy bolt, kept firing. Crews learned tricks passed down from veterans: strip the weapon dry of lubricant, run it clean and cold. When the bolt stuck, they breathed on it or poured coffee across the receiver. When that failed, they urinated on it to thaw the ice. It was crude, but it worked. As one gunner from the 10th Armored put it, you'd give it anything to keep it alive: sweat, breath, whatever heat you had left. The gun didn't ask for much, but it demanded discipline. The M1919A4 could fire for minutes on end, but doing so risked overheating the barrel, melting the rifling, and causing a cook-off, a spontaneous discharge from the heat. In Bastogne, men learned to fire in controlled bursts. 4 seconds, pause, 4 seconds, pause, the rhythm of survival. The assistant gunner would count out loud: 1, 2, 3, 4, stop. When a target was close, discipline gave way to instinct. The Browning roared until steam rose from its barrel, the snow beneath it melted into black slush, and the empty casings formed brass drifts at their knees. The crews of the 101st Airborne and 10th Armored didn't have fortifications, just frozen dirt and improvised bunkers made of tree trunks and ration boxes. They dug holes deep enough for the tripod legs, packed the snow around them, and built firing slits from stones and ice. They learned that a Browning could not only kill, but shield. Its bursts made the Germans hesitate, duck, lose time, and time was everything. Every second bought meant another wounded man evacuated, another squad repositioned, another prayer whispered in the dark. Sometimes the gunners couldn't see what they were shooting at. The Germans attacked under fog, wearing white camouflage. The Americans fired at the sound of boots crunching snow or the flicker of muzzle flashes through the trees. The Brownings barked blindly into the gray, and when the fog lifted, the field was littered with black uniforms against white snow. A paratrooper named Private Alan Green wrote home after the battle,
We couldn't see a thing half the time, but we could hear the Brownings talking. As long as they talked, you didn't feel alone. The psychological power of that sound was immense. The Browning was not as fast as the MG42, not as portable as the bar, but it was reassuring. It sounded methodical, mechanical, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. To American soldiers half buried in ice and terror, that rhythm meant order in chaos. To the Germans advancing through the trees, it meant death was waiting. Behind each gun was a bond forged not in glory, but in repetition and trust. Browning crews rarely received medals. They were the unsung defenders, invisible except for the line of shell casings glittering in the snow. But they held sectors that should have fallen. Their guns covered the flanks, guarded the wounded, and raked the open fields where tanks had no traction. Every belt they fed into the chamber was another minute Bastogne survived. By December 21st, the siege had become total. Ammunition was running out and the men were down to their last boxes of 30-06. The Germans were broadcasting surrender appeals through loudspeakers, promising warm food and blankets. The Browning crews answered with gunfire. Our only blanket was muzzle flash, and it kept us warm enough. In that frostbite hell, the M1919A4 became something elemental, not just steel, but spirit. It didn't shine or roar, it endured. Its very persistence defied the logic of defeat. Every round it fired was a statement carved in smoke. We're still here. And as the snow fell harder and the lines froze tighter, the men who fed those belts of brass understood that the only thing colder than the Ardennes winter was the will of the gun that refused to die.
When the siege closed around Bastogne, there were no clear front lines, only white, broken silhouettes of trees, the smell of cordite, and the constant grind of engines somewhere beyond the fog. The Germans were everywhere and nowhere at once. Their tanks moved like ghosts through the woods, their infantry slipping between shadows. For the men of the 101st Airborne and 10th Armored Division, every direction meant danger. There was no retreat, no resupply, no warm place left in the world. And yet, on the edges of that frozen town, the Browning M1919A4 crews refused to go silent. Each day began not with sunrise, but with artillery. German shells screamed overhead at dawn, tearing through the roofs of barns and churches. The defenders huddled in holes carved into the frozen soil, praying the next shell wouldn't land in their sector. When the bombardment ended, there was a hush, a moment of waiting so tense it hurt to breathe. Then from the mist came the attack. Columns of German infantry, white smocks blending into the snow, pushed forward under the cover of mortars and machine guns. They expected the Americans to crumble, to be too cold and too scattered to fight back. Instead, they met the deep, rhythmic thunder of the Brownings. At the southern approaches near Marvy, a team from the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment held a narrow road against repeated attacks. They had one functioning M1919A4, its barrel already worn silver from heat. The gunner, Sergeant Earl Red Watson, was 23, his assistant barely 19. For 3 nights they manned the weapon without rest. German half-tracks and infantry tried to cross the open field, their shapes flickering in the snow flares. The Brownings' bursts cut through them, controlled, deliberate, never panicked. It sounded like someone hammering a church bell, a nearby medic recalled. Every time it started, you knew we were still holding. Watson's team fired nearly 12,000 rounds in a single night, their hands blistered and blackened from touching the overheated barrel. When ammunition belts froze stiff, they laid them across their bodies to thaw them. When the gun smoked from the cold, they shoveled snow on it, hissing clouds rising like breath from a dragon. At dawn, the field in front of their position was silent, except for the faint ticking of cooling metal. Later, they would find more than 100 German dead in the snow, some lying in the same white camouflage they'd used to disappear. In the village of Foy, the Browning teams of the 501st Parachute Infantry held the churchyard, using gravestones as firing positions. Snow mixed with mud and blood beneath their boots. The Germans sent mortar after mortar trying to silence the guns, but each time one crew was hit, another man crawled forward and took his place. A corporal named Frank Dillon remembered dragging a wounded gunner away from his tripod and setting the weapon back into position. You couldn't let it stop. If one went quiet, they came, so you fired, no matter what. To the soldiers of Bastogne, the Browning's voice became a kind of prayer, a steady rhythm that meant the line still lived. The Germans learned it too. Prisoners later told interrogators that the Americans' machine guns were unnervingly consistent. They did not fire in fear, they admitted. They fired like they were counting seconds. Across the ring of defenses, the same stories played out. In the woods north of town, a gun section from the 502nd Parachute Infantry was surrounded for almost 36 hours. Their radio batteries were dead, their rations gone, and frostbite was claiming fingers. They fired until the last belt ran dry, then scavenged ammo from fallen comrades. When the assistant gunner's gloves froze to the receiver, he ripped them free, leaving skin behind. They stacked snow around the tripod to anchor it against recoil and fired until the barrel glowed cherry red. When relief finally arrived, only one man was still conscious, his fingers still curled on the trigger, the gun barrel fused from heat. The M1919A4 was not a miracle of design, it was a triumph of reliability. Its air cooling system, simple bolt assembly, and rugged steel frame made it indifferent to the elements. Where the Germans' water-cooled MG-08s had long since frozen, and their newer MG-42s required constant cleaning, the Browning kept working. Its slow, deliberate cadence actually saved it. Less friction, less heat, less chance of seizing. Soldiers joked that the gun had lungs. It breathed the snow, coughed up smoke, and kept talking. By December 21st, the siege had entered its worst phase. The German 2nd Panzer Division attacked from the northeast, while elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division probed the southern roads. Tanks appeared out of the fog, their engines growling like beasts in the white forest. Against them, the Browning crews were almost helpless, but not useless. They aimed at the infantry instead, cutting down the supporting grenadiers before they could close in with Panzerfausts. Every burst delayed the next charge. Every belt of ammo bought time for the artillery to regroup, for Patton's Third Army to reach them. Inside the town itself, the 101st Airborne's command post, set in the Bastogne Seminary, shook from nearby explosions. McAuliffe's men were outnumbered, outgunned, and outfood. But every report from the perimeter began the same way: our Brownings still operational. In one after-action log, a lieutenant scribbled the words, "They're freezing, they're starving, but the guns still sing." Night was the worst. The cold deepened, the fog thickened, and the battlefield vanished into blackness. The Germans tried infiltrating between American lines, creeping silently in the snow. But every time they got close, a Browning opened up, its orange muzzle flash lighting the trees, tracer rounds cutting ribbons through the night. The sound of the gun echoed from hill to hill, bouncing off ice and timber, until it seemed like the whole forest was alive with defiance. There were moments when everything else stopped. Artillery gone silent, mortars spent, rifles frozen. Only the Brownings remained. In that stillness, their roar became the heartbeat of Bastogne itself. Soldiers on the far side of town could tell when another sector was under attack by the pattern of the guns. Short bursts meant probing fire, long bursts meant a full assault. It was like Morse code, said one paratrooper. The Brownings talked to each other through the snow. On December 23rd, the sky finally cleared. For the first time in a week, sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting off the snow like shattered glass. The men thought it was a trick of the cold until they heard the faint hum above them, the sound of C-47s. The long-awaited airlift had arrived. Parachutes blossomed across the sky, carrying crates of food, medicine, and most importantly, ammunition. The Browning crews cheered, though most could barely move their frozen lips.
They reloaded their belts and fired into the distance, not at the enemy this time, but as a salute. That day the defenders of Bastogne were still surrounded, still bleeding, still half frozen, but they knew the line would hold, because the guns had never stopped. When mortars failed, when rifles froze, when men fell asleep sitting upright from exhaustion, the Brownings kept their rhythm. It wasn't just the sound of firepower, it was the sound of defiance. And as dusk fell again over the Ardennes, with smoke curling up from shattered barns and snow still drifting through the trees, the last thing the Germans heard was that same stubborn drumbeat echoing through the forest. The song of the Brownings, singing for a town that refused to die.
By the fourth week of December 1944, Bastogne had become a frozen island of exhaustion. The snow no longer looked white. It was gray, churned by boots, stained with smoke and blood. The men of the 101st Airborne Division and the 10th Armored Division had been under siege for nearly 10 days, and time itself had frozen with them. The temperature dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Food was scarce, water turned to ice, and the human body became a machine of endurance. Fingers split open, lips bled, eyelids froze together at night. And through it all, the Browning M1919A4 crews kept their posts, half buried in snow, feeding belts of ammunition through guns that had long since become extensions of their own bodies. Sleep was a luxury none could afford. Every few hours, a German artillery barrage would sweep across the lines, followed by probing attacks. The enemy seemed endless. Volksgrenadiers, Waffen-SS, paratroopers, all fighting under the same gray sky. Between battles, there was silence. Not peace, but a silence so heavy it pressed on the chest. You could hear your own heartbeat, one gunner remembered. Then you'd hear the Browning, and you knew someone else was still alive. The crews no longer spoke much. Their world had shrunk to a rhythm. Feed the belt, fire, clear the snow from the barrel, count the rounds, and start again. Their gloves were stiff with frozen sweat, their hands cracked and blackened by frostbite. When the guns iced over, they used bayonets to chip the bolts free. Some gunners removed their gloves entirely to feel the weapon better, skin fusing briefly to the steel before tearing away. They joked that the gun had tasted blood and that it liked it. The assistant gunners worked beside them in silence, pushing stiff belts into the feed tray with trembling hands. Each belt weighed several pounds, each bullet a small promise of survival. They moved like ghosts in the fog, faces pale and hollow. Yet there was something sacred in their work. You didn't think of it as fighting, wrote Private Lawrence Moffett, a Browning assistant in the 502nd Parachute Infantry. It was like keeping a fire alive. You fed it, kept it breathing, because if it went out, everything went dark. Sometimes the snow fell so thick that it muffled the gunfire entirely. The men could barely see 10 feet ahead. When the Germans attacked under that curtain of white, they appeared like phantoms, their outlines barely visible until they were almost on top of the line. Then the Brownings erupted, long, sustained bursts that shattered the silence. The muzzle flashes lit up the night like lightning. The crews fired until they couldn't tell if the steam rising around them was from the gun or their own breath. Inside Bastogne, the hospital basements overflowed. Medics worked by candlelight, the wounded wrapped in blankets that never got warm. They could still hear the machine guns outside, thumping in the distance like heartbeats. One nurse recalled that sound decades later. Every time a Browning fired, I thought, someone's still fighting for us. On the northern perimeter near Foy, a Browning crew led by Sergeant William MacHarlan held a small farmhouse turned strongpoint. The Germans had hit them 3 times already that night, and the ammunition was almost gone. Harlan's assistant gunner was dead, and his replacement, a 19-year-old from Iowa, had frostbite so bad he could barely move his hands. Still, they refused to abandon the gun. When the next wave came,
Harlan told his partner to hold the feed belt steady, then fired from the hip, sweeping the doorway. He held down the trigger until the barrel glowed orange. When it finally jammed, he drew his sidearm and kept firing until the snow went quiet again. The gun was part of him, a survivor later said. He didn't know where it ended, and he began. These weren't isolated acts of heroism. They were routine. Every Browning crew had its breaking point, and every one of them crossed it. The machine didn't just demand ammunition. It demanded willpower. You had to want it to live. Soldiers burned rations and spare socks for warmth, poured coffee or melted snow over the receiver to keep it cycling. They traded extra belts between foxholes like currency. One belt could mean a life, said a paratrooper from the 506th PIR. We'd carry them like gold. The emotional toll was harder to measure. Many men began talking to their guns as if to a comrade. Some even gave them names. Stella, Old Reliable, Betsy. They cleaned them like they were living things, wiping frost from the receiver, whispering promises under their breath. Come on, girl, don't die on me now. The gun didn't. There were moments, brief and terrible, when the lines faltered. One sector, manned by the 327th Glider Infantry, was nearly overrun when a Browning crew was hit by mortar fire. The gun fell silent, and the Germans began to advance. A runner carrying ammunition heard the silence and turned back. He found the crew dead, their gun half buried in snow. Without hesitation, he dropped to his knees, cleared the jam, and opened fire. The Germans froze. They had thought the line was gone. One man's instinct saved the position. It wasn't courage, he said later. It was the sound of quiet that scared me. By Christmas Eve, Bastogne was a graveyard wrapped in snow. The men hadn't eaten a hot meal in days. Their cigarettes were frozen, their boots cracked. Yet the Browning crews kept watch over every approach, along the roads, behind the hedgerows, beside the shattered churches. Their guns looked monstrous now, coated in frost, barrels warped from heat and cold, paint burned away. But they still worked. A sergeant in the 10th Armored described it perfectly. When everything else failed, radios, trucks, men's bodies, the Browning didn't. It just kept going. It was like the town itself. We were battered, frozen, half dead, but we didn't stop. In that endurance there was something transcendent. Bastogne was not held by strategy or numbers. It was held by trust. Trust between soldiers, trust between man and machine. Each gun crew was a small brotherhood, bound not by rank, but by survival. They had one mission: keep the line alive. When Christmas morning dawned gray and silent, the men barely noticed the date. They were too tired, too cold. But somewhere along the southern perimeter, a Browning opened up again, a short, sharp burst that echoed through the forest. Then another answered it from the west, and another from the north. Soon the whole ring of Bastogne seemed to hymn with gunfire. Not a battle, but a kind of song. It wasn't celebration, it was communication. A way of saying, we're still here. The same three words that had defined their fight, their endurance, their brotherhood. When men finally rotated out after the siege, many refused to leave their guns behind. They would clean them one last time, pack the barrels with snow to cool them, and run their hands over the cold steel like saying goodbye to an old friend. Because in Bastogne, when even God seemed frozen, it was the Brownings and the men who served them that had kept the world from going completely silent.
On the morning of December 22, 1944, as the siege reached its breaking point, a German delegation approached Bastogne under a white flag. Their message was short, typed neatly in German and English, an invitation for the Americans to surrender. The 101st Airborne and the 10th Armored were surrounded, outnumbered, and freezing to death. Surely, reason dictated, they would lay down their arms. The note was carried into the cellar of the Bastogne Seminary, now serving as divisional headquarters. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, bone-tired and numb from days without sleep, skimmed it and laughed. "Nuts," he said, tossing the paper aside. His staff, equally gaunt and frostbitten, stared for a moment before realizing it wasn't anger. It was defiance. The single word, absurd, defiant, perfectly American, became their answer. Nuts. That one syllable captured everything the Browning crews had already expressed through fire and steel. Because long before McAuliffe said it aloud, the men on the perimeter had been shouting it in their own way, in bursts of .30 caliber fire that rang across the frozen hills. Every time the Germans demanded surrender with mortars and machine guns, the answer came back in the stuttering growl of the M1919A4. Nuts, they said with every burst. Nuts, they whispered through cracked lips as they fed another belt into the feed tray. Nuts, they mouthed when the snow burned against their faces and their fingers stopped working. The following days were the darkest. Ammunition was critically low. Rations had dwindled to cold coffee and chocolate bars broken into quarters. Medics melted snow for water. Men burned fence posts to stay warm. Yet the Brownings kept firing, and the sound of them still carried hope. When other weapons froze, they were the only ones that still sang. At the edge of town, near Hamrul, a Browning section from the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment faced a full armored assault. The Germans came with half-tracks supported by infantry in white camouflage. The Browning gunner, Corporal Tom Kiefer, waited until the first figures appeared through the snow and then opened fire. His gun, perched on a mound of frozen earth, kicked back with steady rhythm. The tracers stitched the air, carving fiery paths across the field. The Germans returned fire, bullets slamming into the frozen ground, but Kiefer and his assistant never stopped. When the tripod collapsed under recoil, they fired from the hip. When Kiefer was hit in the arm, his assistant kept feeding the belt. When both were bleeding, they used their knees to hold the gun steady. The only warm thing in Bastogne, Kiefer later said, was the barrel. That same night, over 200 Germans were found dead in front of their position. The Browning had done what it always did. It bought time. Then, on December 23rd, the sky cleared. The men thought it was a hallucination at first, a pale shimmering blue breaking through the smoke. But then they heard the drone of engines, and the heavens opened with parachutes. C-47 transports from England and France dropped supplies, food, ammunition, bandages, and belts of .30-06 linked by the thousands. The air filled with cheers, weak but fierce. The defenders wept as the first crates hit the snow. The Brownings were reloaded. The line, at last, could breathe again. 3 days later, Patton's Third Army broke through the German encirclement from the south. Columns of Sherman tanks rolled through the white fields, their engines roaring like salvation. The road into Bastogne was littered with the frozen wreckage of war. German half-tracks smoldering in ditches, snowdrifts piled high with empty shell casings. When Patton's men reached the town, they found paratroopers standing beside their guns, smoke rising from the barrels. They didn't cheer, didn't celebrate. They simply nodded and went back to cleaning their weapons. The fight wasn't over. When the siege was finally lifted, the M1919A4 stood as the unsung hero of Bastogne. It had endured cold, ice, and ceaseless combat without faltering. Its air-cooled barrel, mocked by some as outdated, had proven superior in the bitter frost. Its slow, steady rate of fire had conserved ammunition when every round mattered. And its crews, the half-frozen, sleep-deprived soldiers who manned them, had turned the machine into something greater than metal. They had made it a symbol of endurance. In the weeks that followed, when the 101st was relieved and the survivors staggered out of the snow, reporters asked what kept them alive. The answers were always the same. The Brownings, they said. Those guns never quit. General McAuliffe himself later admitted that the Browning machine guns were the backbone of the defense. They held the line when nothing else could. They were our last argument.
After the war, the M1919A4 continued to serve in Korea, in Vietnam, even in smaller conflicts across the world. Its design was replaced by newer weapons, but never forgotten. In the museums of Bastogne today, the Brownings still sit behind glass, their steel scarred, their barrels blackened. Tourists walk past them without realizing that these are not relics, they are survivors. The guns on display are the same ones that spat defiance into the freezing wind while men around them prayed not to die. On one preserved weapon, the initials WJ plus FH are scratched into the receiver. The gunner and his assistant, both killed on Christmas Eve 1944. Their gun was found upright, buried in snow, the feed belt half spent. A small plaque beside it reads, "When mortars stopped and rifles froze, the Brownings kept singing." That sound, that steady, unyielding beat, became the soundtrack of Bastogne's legend. In it there was everything: fear, anger, faith, and love. The soldiers who fought there would never forget it. They would hear it in their dreams for the rest of their lives. The deep thud of the Browning echoing across a white forest, the proof that they had not been abandoned. History remembers Bastogne as a miracle of resistance, a story of airborne heroes and impossible odds. But in the end, it was not miracles that held the line. It was machines, and the men who refused to let them fall silent. Even now, on quiet winter nights in the Ardennes, locals say that when the wind is right, you can hear it, faint, rhythmic, like a heartbeat rolling through the trees. Not artillery, not thunder, just the whisper of old guns still singing in the snow, keeping watch over the town they refused to surrender. Because when everything else froze, the Brownings kept breathing.